Hey everybody, I'm Francesca Maximé, and welcome back to Inside Out with Natasha and Francesca. This week, Natasha's back on board, and happy to see you, Natasha. You're hailing in from another part of the country, but we're here live nonetheless.
Yes, and it's great to be here. Great to see you. And I'm really looking forward to some of the conversations we're going to have today about what to do and what not to do in therapy when you're talking about race with white people and people of color.
Exactly right, and I think that this is such a hot topic, and as you and I were discussing it, we're sort of discussing it in the sense of it being like the baseline. Like this is sort of the baseline piece around how do we really just even start to have the conversation, open to have the conversation, and the different considerations and all the ways in which not having the conversation in some ways is worse than having the conversation, although the conversation still can be had poorly, but then it's the onus on the therapist to reinitiate, oops, ouch, my bad, and take accountability and try again in a different way that might be more helpful.
Hmm. Yeah. And I think that there's a lot of ways in which therapists, especially white therapists, are not at all prepared, meaning that they're not at all trained in their professional training, as well as not prepared in their personal life to talk about race, and certainly not to talk about race as it pertains to them.
Right, them as therapists. And that's what I think the whole purpose of calling the show Inside Out is. As a therapist, how are we looking at interrogating our own social location and our own comfort with whatever that social location is? So where's our awareness with that, but then is also how we're feeling about that, meaning like, are we like, oh, I kind of really never grokked or acknowledged that I'm living in this white supremacist society as a white bodied person, and that I'm carrying that identity along with the other pieces of my intersectionality that have to do with language or education or religion or marital status or these kinds of things, class, economics, all these things, and how they play out in terms of the dynamic that I bring into not only what I've learned through my psychotherapeutic training, but also what I do and engage in the ways in which I engage with clients in session in real time
Hmm.
in times like today. So I know you've done a ton of work on that, and I'm curious to hear more about it. We also have some tweets that I think kind of speak to this issue, that we can maybe call up in a little bit, unless you wanted to start there.
Well, I was just thinking as you were talking about this issue of how much, in terms of identity for therapists, for many white therapists, so many therapists are women, and a lot of women who are therapists are fairly comfortable talking about gender as a factor in their lives and their patients' lives
Speak
and
to
their
this issue.
clients' lives. But when it comes to race, it's almost the inverse. As good as people are about talking about gender, is sort of as bad as they are as talking about race. And so there's a process there that people have gone through, and many female therapists and even male therapists, white therapists, have gone through talking about gender, and understanding the role of gender. And yet the similar process that people need to go through to be able to talk about race with their black and brown clients as well as their non-black and brown clients, that's something that really is only just in the very beginning stages, which
Hmm.
is, and there does need to be accountability for that with individual therapists. Why is this only something you're starting now? And also within training and within education of therapists, because that's where it also should be happening, and even if individual therapists are not taking this upon themselves, there's no excuse for training programs, which for about the last 20 to 30 years have been aware, of the movement within psychology and social work and other therapeutic modalities to become more multicultural. This is hardly a new phenomenon within the psychotherapeutic world.
But I think that that's always about, like, we always say, like, white is the race nobody talks about, right? So, like, being the multicultural training, that you get is on Black people, on Latinx, population is on, but what about the interrogation of whiteness, which is this whole constructed piece? At least that was in my recent experience when I was in school training, you know?
Right, right. Go ahead.
No, so just how do we turn it around so that it's a both and, so that we talk about things like social determinants of health, it isn't co-opted to be used by something like, okay, well, now we're talking about people who, are in positions of oppression or marginalization, but that we're also using it to talk about, well, what is it that are the social determinants of health for those who are privileged racially?
Right. Well, you just did that interview with Janet Helms, and Janet Helms is the first person, really, whoever within the field of psychology, at least, to sort of create a framework for understanding whiteness as a phenomenon, or white as a race, and a social group with its own kind of traditions and quirks. Most prominently racist thought and racist behavior. You know, um, and so her whole framework was about preventing harm, preventing white therapists from doing harm to Black and Brown clients. And in a lot of ways, that's how multicultural, training within psychotherapy is conceptualized, is like, how do you stop the harm? And yet, interestingly, the focus has always been on non-Black and Brown therapists understanding the experience of Black and Brown people.
Hmm.
And clearly that has made some difference. But it's been a lot easier for non-Black and Brown therapists and psychologists and social workers to focus on the experiences of Black and Brown people and trying to, quote unquote, understand them,
Yes.
while at the same time never understanding our own parallel experience as a social group,
I
if that
couldn't
makes
agree.
sense.
No,
And so
I
the
couldn't.
harm sort of continues. Without that self-understanding, the harm continues. And that's what I think the last 10, 15 years has shown, is like, no matter how much non-Black and Brown people are working to be more understanding of other groups and their difference, as long as our normativeness or our lack of difference remains kind of untouched, the harm doesn't stop.
Exactly. And I so appreciate what you're saying here, because this came up recently in a listserv that I'm in for trauma therapists, and one of the white female therapists was saying that that she had done something that maybe was a little bit of a misstep with a Black client, and sort of went in with some kind of inquiry or something around, like, let I want to be open to being able to talk about race now, or something, which is a fine way to sort of do that. But I don't know any person of color who, unless a white person has done their work around that, which includes the historical context, is going to be like, oh, that's just fine. Like, I feel like automatically safe just because you're giving me permission. But that this, and I'll get back to that piece in a moment, but that the piece was that I really took umbrage with was I want to understand Black trauma better. And I was like, I want you to understand whiteness and white trauma more, please. And then
Mhm.
from that
Yeah,
place, you will understand the trauma on BIPOC communities, in terms of how the systems of oppression are set up to continue to perpetuate that trauma, right? Like, you won't understand what it's like to walk around in a racialized society with Black and brown skin and feeling like, you are a potential target, like George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery, right? Like, you won't understand that. You can't. You won't understand what it feels like to be embodied, racially oppressed, traumatized intergenerationally in that way for this racial construct and division around Black and brown skin. However, if you interrogate whiteness and the systems that are put in place in terms of what keeps that going, you will be in a much better position to be open to getting, like, I can see how these systems of oppression basically are so narrow, so rigid, so challenging. And I'm here with that kind of embodiment, with that information, but that kind of comes from the inside out, from doing the piece on interrogating to whiteness. So it's understanding whiteness as trauma, and then from there comes just understanding that we're all harmed by that.
absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that, this idea of like, I want to understand Black or Brown trauma better, I think is very telling, not in a kind of like, ooh, gotcha way, but just like in a sort of unintentionally revealing way. Because I think that it's not the lack of understanding that is the issue. The issue is, or the lack of attempt to understand, because I don't really know at this point how much more one could do to understand, right? It's like all there, and it all has been there for the last 400 years, and nothing is a secret here. This has all sort of been playing out in technicolor. So it's not so much that people have not wanted to understand, non-Black and brown people have not wanted to understand. The intention is there to understand. The problem is there's a block on understanding. And I
Mhm.
always think back to Jesse Jackson, who said during Katrina, and Jesse Jackson is, complicated, but he does sometimes really hit the nail on the head. And he said, America has a very high tolerance for Black pain. And it's the tolerance for the pain that is the issue, and the kind of degree to which there is a, implicit, explicit, like I think there's a lot we could sort of look at there of whether this is unconscious or not, or how unconscious it is. But the problem is within the people attempting to understand, not within the people who need to be understood. And that's sort of also a real uh, foundational aspect of our understanding of human psychology, is it's usually not the person who is sort of experiencing the trauma who has trouble being understood. It's the people who are either perpetuating or ignoring the trauma that are having trouble with their capacity to understand. And so
Mhm.
that's why the focus has to come back onto whiteness, or onto the people who are not Black and brown, because that's where the block is,
Right, right,
you
right. And
know?
so, yeah, for sure. And to further that point, you know, to use Jesse Jackson's quote, uh, America has a high tolerance for Black pain, and yet white Americans tend to have a very low tolerance, distress tolerance for themselves, meaning for their own capacity. You just use the word capacity. And as a somatic experiencing practitioner, we talk about demand and capacity. And we talk about how your nervous system only has a certain kind of a capacity, whatever that is, and that your window of tolerance, you're looking at something of perhaps expanding over time gently with a titrated way, perhaps one molecule at a time. We're not doing exposure therapy. We're not doing, all kinds of catharses, kinds of experiences. We're doing a gentle expansion, the way you would in an accordion or something over time, of deepening or increasing your capacity, your window of tolerance for distress. And as white people, that often bumps into shame, bumps into feelings of worthiness, bumps into feelings of not good enough or I'm not doing it right. And that discomfort is then, in my experience, used as an excuse to not then go back and say, okay, well, I'm going to deepen my capacity to be with this distress, to recognize racial trauma as a phenomenon that affects everyone, and systemic oppression as a series of oppressive structures and natures for centuries that have very much heavily impacted, intentionally so, Black and brown bodies. And I am going to then not associate myself with being that, but I'm still going to hold myself in warm, positive self regard with my own inner dignity and wisdom and my own awareness. And I am going to become aware and be in relationship to my feelings, sensations, and emotions about the ways in which those structures of oppression play out and impact people of color as well as myself. And then from that place, I am going to start to be able to do the work, knowing that I'm in this place of, yes, privilege, but that doesn't mean that I have to go down a shame spiral necessarily and get stopped or stuck, so that I'm not able to then reemerge into connective, embodied, relational, reparative, and in this case, therapeutic action in session or beyond. So
Hmm.
it's the shame piece that I feel is often the block.
Absolutely. And I think that in my mind, these two things, the kind of high tolerance for the pain of others, the scapegoats, and the very low tolerance for my own pain, are very connected. These two things are sort of like two sides of the same coin. Like, I don't have any ability to kind of tolerate my own negative feelings. And therefore, I don't want to hear about them from anybody else.
Mm.
And I think that's the family system. Like, this is the family piece of how white supremacy gets perpetuated, is within this family system, there's no tolerance for these negative feelings, shame, pain, complaints, don't complain, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And then you see that externalized into the world as, oh, these people are complaining. Let me put my negative feelings about everything onto them so that I can deal with, so that can help me deal with my own shame and my own pain. And so, like, these two things kind of operate in tandem. And that's where the parenting comes in. And that's where the sort of the deeper understanding of the family system is useful. Like, I think a lot of these more overt forms of white supremacy, policing, the prison system, like, these things have their germination in the family, within
Mm.
the white family. And I think that's a very important thing for us as therapists to start to interrogate and to make those connections more closely for our non-Black and brown clients.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit more about the family? Because I know that we're talking off air before we started the show about, for example, the new quote unquote tell all memoir from Mary Trump, who is a clinical psychologist, who is the niece of our 45th president. And that I didn't say that, but Um, I was going to just say 45, but I tried to defer. So anyway, in this memoir, basically talking about the trauma within the family of Fred Trump, who,
Mhm.
sort of fomented competition and, from the mindfulness perspective, we talk about fear and love, abundance and scarcity, rigidity and flexibility, and how being an adaptive child, being stuck in your trauma response is where most people live out their lives, which is so sad. I mean, we'd be out of a job if they didn't, which is nice. I would rather do something else. But at the same time, I wouldn't, but you know what I mean? I'm sure we'd all find other
Right,
things to do.
right.
Um, and that this piece of being stuck in your adaptive child is that rigid, one of my teachers, Terry
Yeah.
Real, calls it your inner fundamentalist. And that,
Mhm.
moving into your more adult, embodied adult self, mature, emotionally mature, actualized, having
Mhm.
agency and differentiation, individualization, that you become more less rigid and more flexible, more adaptable, and more discerning. And that in this case of 45, that was all to your point about these systems of oppression are started in the family. This memoir, just because it's this week, we're talking about whatever it is, the first week of July that we're in, second week of July, coming out now. It seems as though, as you say, the germination, the seeds are also there, and we see how that's now playing out in the world stage.
Right, and I mean, there are a lot of ways in which these family systems are very easily kind of like transferred, and really, I mean, as we've talked about in the past, like in the service of white supremacy or in the service of a more authoritarian social structure. Because, you know, my understanding is that Fred Trump Sr. was, first of all, was a German family, and my understanding was there was sympathy towards um, the more fascist movements of the 30s and 40s within the family.
Mhm.
So already you're talking about a very authoritarian structure. And my understanding, although I haven't read the book yet, is that the family was very authoritarian and it was very patriarchal in terms of, like, the father was sort of this very overbearing and controlling figure within the family who really determined in many ways the fates of the two sons. Well, there was three sons, and I don't know what the role of the third was, but he obviously is very loyal at this point. And then there was a daughter. But I guess in terms of the family system, there was a scapegoat, and he was the one who wanted to sort of not participate in he wasn't interested in following the father's
Right.
footsteps.
Fred Jr., the eldest son, was the
Right.
scapegoat who died of alcoholism at 41, and whom this claims that are made in the book was the scapegoat and kind of dumped upon within the family, and that our that 45 said, okay, well, I'm going to jump on the bandwagon and align with my dad to sort of dump on my older brother here because he doesn't want to take over the real estate business. These are the claims in the book, according to the article that was published yesterday in the New York Times.
Right. And so this theme of like, these themes within a family of like competition, the pitting of the different siblings against each other, the kind of the vying for the top spot, the vying for the approval of the parent, you know, and then if you don't get the approval of the parent, you're kind of cast out, you're sort of detached from, you become like the sort of the one who takes all of the shame and all of the bad feeling for the whole family. I mean, that is obviously like a microcosm of the white supremacist system.
Mm.
And so, and, you know, after World War II, there was a lot of work done by various psychologists and people who were interested in human psychology about what had happened during the Holocaust. And out of that came this book, The Authoritarian Personality, which was all about trying to understand how it was that a society that was sort of functioning normally could then turn into this much more murderous, genocidal machine that eliminated, you know, millions and millions of people who up until that point had been living as neighbors, even though, you know, so historically persecuted, but, you know, had up to that point been at least marginally safe for several decades, how that had turned, you know, over a course of a decade.
And even if you
And
look at
a lot of that work
No, go ahead.
was, well, a lot of, and that was Theodor Adorno, and a lot of his conclusions were that this had to do with a family system and personality systems that really made a culture vulnerable. And I think we can look now and say, like, our culture is very vulnerable and was very vulnerable and has been very vulnerable to this white supremacy because of a lot of the things that happen within families that then prime people to be very good soldiers within
Mm.
this system, even to the point where they feel like they don't want to be.
Right. So which comes first, the chicken or the egg? The policy structural outside change, the inside change around changing the family, changing the system? Because it's said in family systems therapy, any kind of ecological perspective, you know, biospheric kind of analysis, that when one thing changed, necessarily the system will change. Because if one person, you know, pulls out or changes their behavior, whatever, and does not participate in the repetitive pattern, that just causally it will become something different.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think, and to use your language, it's always a both and, because also within families, reality changes the family, right? Someone dies, somebody moves away, somebody, you know, somebody loses their job, somebody, you know, things change within a family that are not necessarily a result of simply an individual making a change. And so I think, you know, when we talk about the chicken and the egg, I think it is a both and. Like, I think the policy, like, it's necessary for people to continue to work on the policy piece. And then I think it's necessary for people to work on the personal growth, inner work of, you know, becoming less racist and anti-racist, which is where I think therapists come in. You know, like, in other words, anti-racist therapists have, this is our piece. You know, like, we're not working in policy, we're working in therapy sessions with people who are not Black and brown, in addition to people who are Black and brown. And I think there's a lot of work we can do in the therapy world also, because the therapy world itself is very white supremacist in terms of like who gets the jobs, who gets the money,
Say
who
it
gets
again
to
for
be
the kids in the
training.
back.
So, you know, like, it doesn't even have to be an either or a both and. And I think my whole focus is kind of bringing it home for therapists, because a lot of times therapists feel like, well, I really want to do anti-racist work, but I want to do it in like my off hours,
I
you know,
hear
and
that all the time.
it feels very hard to think about how do you just bring it home into your sessions, even though a lot of people, especially people who are working with non-Black and brown clients, are literally working with like white minds day in and day out, and their own white mind.
Right. Yes, I've heard that so much that, I mean, the whole, from a mindfulness perspective, everything is about this false illusion of separation,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I mean, you can talk about existential angst, you can talk about fear of death, you can talk about this idea that we aren't connected, or you can look at it from the perspective of interconnection, interdependence, process, quantum physics, the flow, everything being synergistically, either in or out of homeostatic balance, right? And
Mm-hmm.
sort of this idea of re-regulating is part of what we're all trying to do. And how does that play out in our one-on-one nervous system, but also our collective cultural soma and nervous system, like Resmaa Menakem and
Mm-hmm.
Tada Hazumi talk about. And
Mm-hmm.
so when we look at these sort of systems of regulating and coming back into balance, my whole thing is, listen, this isn't like a side gig. It's not something that like isn't good for you. It's just something that you haven't been paying attention to because of structures of oppression and privilege that include
Mm-hmm.
things like segregated neighborhoods and home values and who gets to buy what and
Mm-hmm.
who's allowed to have a mortgage and what school system you want your kid to go to because you want your kid to have a good education, which is right. But that property taxes fund school districts. And then that's why things end up, being not as available, in urban settings that more kids of color might be in. Those are all reality factors that like, okay, we're a therapist, but how aware are we of those things? And how can we bring some of that into what it is that we're using to inform the way in which we show up around what is in our awareness, what is in our conscious piece within the therapy room? Or to use your earlier point about blockage, do we just get stuck in a shame spiral or feel bad about that? Like, it's okay to like want your kid to go to school in a nice neighborhood in a nice school and to also want to work for social justice and say it's not good for, I see you formulating a thought, for other kids to not have access to that. And that a lot of people, even therapists, think in binary terms where they
Yeah.
feel like I can't lean in and talk about racism without really feeling super comfortable or fully there yet about knowing how to do it perfectly or being anti-racist. And I'm suggesting that there's a way to do it, and you are too, clearly why we're doing this, is to say there is a way to do some of the work so you bring yourself up to a baseline of comfort about some of this stuff. And then you can open up the conversation to see whether or not people want to discuss any of this, but that it's incumbent on you to integrate this into your life as part of your life's work and not as some thing you do, but some part of how you're becoming, because it also is helpful to you, your citizenry, your well-being, your own neuroses or lack thereof, hopefully, and your own general growth and embodiment, right? I think it doesn't hurt anyone. It's helpful to anyone. But when we see it as like, this is something for Black people, for people of color that I do over here, and it's kind of like a burden, when that's our framework, we aren't going to go into it with openness and curiosity and receive some of the benefits that it would also have for us.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, absolutely everything that you just said. I think the fly in the ointment is that the deeper people who are not Black and brown, and even Black and brown people, go into anti-racist work, the more it puts you in conflict with the degree to which your comfort as a citizen in a capitalist society uh, does exclude other people. And so the more your own success and your own mortgage and your own good school system and all of these things that feel like and really are just basic human needs, shelter, clothing, something nice for your kids to do, realizing their dreams, like these things are in many ways bound up with exclusion. And
Given the
that is
structure we have now, but it doesn't have to
exactly
be that way.
right. Absolutely. But I think people do get very stuck in the concrete details because they're concrete. It really does affect people. And so, in some ways, encouraging people to, like, I see a big part of our work is encouraging people to mourn the degree to which they've been born into a system that is very, even people who are not Black and brown have been born into a system that requires them to take on, as you say, a moral injury, right? Exactly. So, and I think this concept of moral injury is very helpful because it does kind of get at the way that having an identity in America, no matter where you sit, is going to be negatively impacted by the
Right.
system. And some people have, brings us back to what we talked about in the beginning, have a very good defense, which is, kind of the ability to check out via success, via the ability to avoid, via privilege, the kind of more painful aspects of being an American. And yet there really is nowhere for anybody to hide.
Right.
If
Right.
you're going to get down to the real psychological costs.
Right.
It's just that some people can hide, like, good example is, the Trump family. Like, some people can hide in privilege, and yet you can see the costs they're paying all over them. It's quite obvious. But, it's a lot easier to bear those costs when you can distract yourself with money and fame and
Right.
success. And
I know. Trust me.
so, it is a both and, in terms of, like, we do need to continue to work on and really quickly dismantle, as quickly as possible, fight to dismantle this sort of exoskeleton, while at the same time working on dissolving the
Right.
inner structures.
Right. I call it the decalcification. Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, yeah, it's totally a both and. We have a couple of things. I want to get to these tweets. If Brian, maybe you can kind of cue that up a little bit. But in the meantime, I want to get to a question that we have from the audience. How does the function of acceptance play into the rigidity of the status quo? How does the function of acceptance play into the rigidity of the status quo?
That's interesting. I wonder what the person means by acceptance, because I think there is a way in which acceptance is really misunderstood in a more general sense. The idea of, like, what does it mean to accept something? This comes up in therapy a lot, because we talk about this idea of radical acceptance, which is a mindfulness concept, and popularized by Tara Brach. Um, but often I think the idea of acceptance is understood meaning that you have to kind of adjust yourself and accept something that feels very unacceptable,
Mm.
as opposed to just facing the way I understand acceptance, which is like facing reality, and
Mhm.
stop denying the reality as it is. And then once you've fully kind of allowed yourself to acknowledge the reality that you're living in, that allows you to then make different kinds of choices. Like, a good
Mhm.
example would be, like, you're in a relationship with someone who's an addict. And so the idea of radical acceptance there would, it often feels like, well, it just means that I have to accept the fact that they're going to come in at 3 a.m. every night, or I'll never really know where they are. And
No.
I hate living like that. And it stresses me out and I'm miserable. And it doesn't mean that. What it means is coming to terms with the fact that this is a problem outside of your control,
Right.
and giving up some of these more denial based ideas, which is like, well, if I just do this, maybe they'll stop, or if I just do that, maybe they'll stop, and really allowing yourself to grapple with the cold, hard truth that this is not going to change on your timeline, no matter what you do. And
Mhm.
then once you're there, it becomes easier to make choice. Well, I don't know about easier, but it becomes more clear cut what your choices are, your real choices, not your denial based choices or your fear based choices, but your real choices, your options.
Right, right, right. Well, that's why I always talk about how, I mean, acceptance is a weird word. Sometimes people don't like it because they feel like it means that they're co-signing something or whatever. And I'm
Yeah.
saying, no, it's not. Even if acceptance feels too strong, use allow, meaning let me be with, let me allow the reality of what's
Hmm.
here to
Hmm.
actually be part of what I can be present to. I don't have to like it. I can notice if I like it, I don't like it, or I want to
Hmm.
ignore it and zone out about it. And those are also mindfulness pieces. How do I feel about what that reality is? But first, I have to be able to allow myself to be present with it. And in my experience, nobody can do that or wants to do that if they're coming from a place of, I don't know, I'll use original sin as a concept, but is they're coming a place of one down? If they're coming from a
Hmm.
place of there's something wrong with me, whatever. But if you come from a place of I am, as I started with, there's nothing wrong with me, my essential self, my deepest self. I can hold myself in warm, positive self regard. And I can recognize my imprintings. I can recognize my conditioning in this society, in this racist culture, in this supremacist culture, whatever skin color I am. We all have internalized some of this, right? We couldn't not, because it's adaptive to surviving in it. And then from that place of centering, I can then lean in and start to do some of the work of whatever it would be that would be wise to do. So I like allowing over accepting as a word there, but whatever, it's just me. Okay, the clarification around the question was socialization by parental norms, but I think we covered it. I think you got it.
Well, and I think that I think that the function of acceptance is that people are socialized into this structure of a hierarchy. And this was so interesting in your conversation last week, which I thought was just like really mind-blowing, where the person you interviewed really got deeply into how much it felt like, even though she's Korean American, that she was very much socialized into a hierarchy, and that makes it very adaptable, made her very adaptable. And she was observing that sort of the microculture of Korean Americans who were very religious, who moved to Queens, like that they were very adaptable in some ways to the white supremacist structure, because there was a sort of implicit understanding of like, my role is I need to find out where I belong in a hierarchy and then fit into it. And the idea of having solidarity across a hierarchy and kind of rejecting the hierarchy was very taboo, because it felt like something that was dangerous.
Yeah.
And that's a very good encapsulation of sort of the white supremacist system, and how it really divides and conquers anyone who is within it, who's not at the very top. And I do think that the acceptance, the desire to be accepted, is an extremely strong motivator for people. And I think, as I was sort of getting at, and we talked a little bit about in the Trump family, the price of not being accepted within a family and not being accepted within the culture is extremely high. I mean, it's death at its most potent. It's death by exclusion, or it's death by oppression. And so, the white supremacist system is not fooling around whether you're in a family or you're in the culture at large. And I think that people's fear and shame is in some ways just a realistic acknowledgement of how much is at stake if you're going to defy this system. And I think in therapy, we definitely don't focus enough on defiance. And that was another interesting aspect of that conversation you had last week, was where she talked about how hard it was for people to do anger. And that's for sure true in therapy with non-Black and brown people as well. Like, if I had a nickel for every time someone said to me, well, I just don't want to be that angry person, as if that's deeply socialized within us, not to be that angry, bitter person.
Yeah.
And we make Black women be the angry people and Black men be the angry people. But in some ways, we just pathologize a normal reaction of anger. And we don't know what to do with it in ourselves, and we pathologize it in others. And so that's another place that therapists have a job to do. Why can't we encourage people to be defiant? I mean, if something's wrong, why shouldn't you be?
Well, I think that there's something there, though, about behavior, because people associate that if I have the energy of anger arising in me, rather than see it as a healthy defense or a healthy rebalancing in social justice or a healthy aggression, a life force about something wanting to move forward and right a wrong, we associate it with being the whole person. It's like the wet blanket soaks right through us and we become the anger, which is based on the way in which we would then show up behaviorally and then cause harm outwardly. And we don't want to do that, obviously. And we also don't want to take accountability for the ways in which neglect and silence, cause harm that is just as, if not more, harmful. But that this action-oriented thing that people associate anger as being bad, but they don't have a relationship to their anger and get curious about what is it that it's here to tell me. And then again, from that place of I'm enough and I matter, I'm okay, I'm curious about what this energy of anger is here about. And what is it trying to show me? And most of the time in my experience with clients, when there's, clients who are like social justice warriors and stuff, they want to get back at their dad that used to beat them up when they were 5, or they want to get back at their, bully from school. So all of this angry energy that causes problems from their privileged place that they don't want to be associated with. They want to be a good person, or they associate with, I don't want to be the bully, but I still want the bully to be held accountable. Right. Yeah. So that's an appropriate, healthy energy to have, but then to be with that and start to repair that wound internally with the you that was bullied and the you who's an adult who's able to be with the you that's still hurting from that, mend that relationship, and then show up as a cohesive, integrated self, and then be able to say, well, yeah, I can be with when I get angry here. I know what that's about. It doesn't have to define me, and I don't have to be the angry person and then put all the blame of anger on Black and brown people.
Right. And I mean, it absolutely. And I think it's really interesting that you brought that up because I work with a much higher percentage of white people and mostly white women. And from the white women that I work in with, you wouldn't think there was like a phenomenon of Karen because people are so not into
You said Karens.
Karens.
Well, which for people who don't know, who probably do know if you're watching this online, is the meme around white women who are otherwise sort of like asking for the store manager, the ones who are ripping down masks because they don't want to wear them or something at Target.
Very rageful. It's
the Amy Cooper in, there's a lot of rage just fomenting and simmering under the system. It's the Emmett Till, accusatory white woman in the, five and dime store sort of piece, which there's a whole backstory there. And she said that it didn't happen and she's sorry about it and all those things. But anyway, that's a whole other piece.
Right, but this idea of the vengeful, angry, and dangerous white woman does not show up in a therapy session. And in fact, in a therapy session, I hear a lot of women, which is not to say that the individual women I work with would necessarily be a Karen, but this phenomenon of like not being angry and really kind of feeling like being an angry person is a bad thing among white women is an interesting juxtaposition to this phenomenon of very rageful white women. And maybe it's two different populations, I don't know, but it does again seem to be two sides of the same coin. It's two extremes, like a bunch of white women who can't get angry and are like, don't let me be angry. And then this other group of white women who are just like rageful and condemning people to death and calling the police on 5-year-olds selling lemonade. Again, it feels very dualistic, to say the least.
All right.
And so, maybe that's a good transition to the tweet.
Yeah, let's call that up, Brian. We have the tweets that I thought were interesting. This is a tweet from somebody named Erin B. Logan on Twitter. And there was a tweet where she started by saying, and you'll see it on the screen share soon, 2 weeks ago, I called my company-sponsored therapy hotline because I was at my wit's end. When I was talking to the woman, I began talking about what I was going through. Then I brought up racism, and the woman, who's the therapist, started crying. I was also crying. So two people crying at once is counterproductive. Mind you, this is the client who's calling the therapist, right? So the therapist is now crying.
And it's a hotline. So this isn't an established therapy relationship, but it could be.
This is the kind of thing that can happen, right? And so this is just an example. Like clearly one could say, but that would never happen to me. I've been working with my client for 5 years or 2 years or whatever. Well, maybe, we don't know. It says, I was also crying. So two people crying at once is counterproductive, especially when one of the persons is supposed to be a mental health professional. She told me that as a non-person of color, she didn't grow up that way and that she couldn't believe people in 2020 were still being racist. We can't even get support on a mental health hotline, says this Erin Logan. After centering herself, and this is the big piece, after centering herself and her white guilt for what felt like an hour, she asked if I wanted to talk to a therapist of color for extended sessions. I told her I wanted to talk to a Black woman, and I am now talking to a Black woman who doesn't cry when I talk about racism. My whole point is you could be a white woman and not cry and have the conversation about racism with a Black client, but that obviously didn't happen here, and I feel bad for Erin Logan, but I guess she got the help she needed in the end. So what are your thoughts on that, Dr. Stovall?
Well, it's a fail, and I think it reminds me of when I won't even tell the story, but yeah, I think it's unfortunately not an unusual experience for Black and brown people who go into therapy. And as a natural course of their therapy, or maybe even why they are in therapy, they need to talk about racialized trauma. And when they talk about racialized trauma, they encounter a non-Black and brown therapist who is then overwhelmed and triggered and can't control what we call their countertransference, or their, you had some other good language for it, but they can't handle their own feelings. And so they wind up kind of re-traumatizing or just really interfering in the treatment and the help that they're supposed to be given and are being paid to give. And so, I mean, I go back and forth with, I mean, first of all, I do think, and not to, I do think that people who come for help should be aware that there are structures to report ethics violations. And this is one, or just incompetence, because this is incompetence. And
What
this
you're
person
saying is
should
that
be,
if you go to someone who's a professional, a licensed psychotherapist, or someone in this situation,
or even on a hotline, yeah,
that you shouldn't have to deal with this, and that there are methods of reporting that.
Yeah, I mean, whether or not, I mean, I guess it's hard to have faith that a person will necessarily there will be accountability, but theoretically, there are structures that exist in our profession around licensing that that happened here is actually a violation of this person's work responsibilities. For example, if somebody called in a state of self-harm, and the person had said, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry," and started crying, this should never and really couldn't deliver the treatment that they were there to be delivering, they should be removed from that situation. Now, whether or not that would happen, especially around race, is a big question mark. And so I don't know that I don't know if it's ethical to tell someone like, look, you should report that, but I do think that's theoretically what should happen, is that person should be pulled off and either taken off those calls altogether, or made to do some kind of, retraining, because that's just unacceptable. However, that's one piece of it. But the other piece is that I think it sort of illustrates how, for Black and brown people, the lack of trust in the system extends to the mental health system. And I think that that's a really important piece for the mental health system to begin to grapple with, because we see ourselves as helpers, and often we see ourselves as sort of like separate from the sort of more punitive side of the system. And yet mental health is very much implicated and weaponized within the white supremacist, sort of the more punitive police, prison system, like all of these, like sort of school to prison pipeline. Mental health is right there all the way, including private practice, including, all of the pieces. And so this ideal that we have of ourselves as not being part of the system is also something that needs to be interrogated.
Yeah, that's really important, and I think that there's also an article that somebody just wrote about fellow white therapists and microaggressions, that it's just sort of part and parcel of the kind of work that one needs to do in terms of being aware of what really is at play. I mean, when I think of that tweet, what I think of is, if I'm the therapist who's crying, my capacity, because we're talking about demand and capacity, my demand on showing up for this person who's in distress, this Black caller who's calling the hotline, exceeds, the demand being put on me and my system is exceeding the capacity that I have. And whatever I need to do to increase that capacity to be able to show up for them is what I need to do as a therapist in this relationship. But that, for me, if the person is crying and I'm receiving that and I'm crying too, when was it not safe for me to cry or to bear witness to crying? Who was not there for me when I was crying as a child? When did I feel lonely, overwhelmed, or like the world was going to fall apart when I saw tears? Was my mother, the person, or father, the person, or brother, or grandfather, or caregiver, the person who, when they cried, I knew that we weren't going to eat for a month, or I knew that a beating was coming, or I knew that whatever. So my own internal awareness of my association with crying, and then my own story or narrative or prescription about what I need to do to maybe fix the crying, as opposed to be with and accompany and actually make friends with the part that's crying, that mindful curiosity that I can be empathetic and compassionate and present to this woman's distress, but not be consumed by it, over identified with it, and then, have this whole piece around it where I become submerged in it, and then I don't become effective. So
Right.
that's work for the therapist to do, in addition to all of the stuff around racial trauma or around confidence or self-esteem or
Right.
whatever it is, that's the own inner work.
Right. And I think that it does need to be made specific to race for people who are not Black and brown, because probably this person is perfectly capable of picking up the phone and dealing with a teenager who's cutting. But when a, adult Black woman comes on and wants to talk about racism, suddenly that is super triggering. And that's what I think is really both sort of fascinating on a intellectual level, but in terms of the actual effect on, individual Black and brown people who are trying to get help is, you know, extremely problematic and extremely wrong. And I think that, again, going back to this question of like, is it the policy versus like the individual? This is really a problem of the mental health system as well, because the chances are if a Black woman calls a mental health hotline, 9 times out of 10, she's not going to get a Black woman or even a brown woman or a brown man who's going to be able to reflect to her back, yes, I know exactly what you're talking about. Please go on, tell me more. Let's strategize how to get you the help you need. Instead, they're going to get somebody they're going to have to manage their caregiver's reaction. And that's a systemic problem as well, because it has to do with how all the barriers to access for Black and brown people who want to get into the mental health field. And so that's why it's
Right.
also incumbent on therapists who want to be anti-racist, who want to become anti-racist, to look to the structures as well as to the internal. It's a lot of work
Right.
at
And
once,
and I think, go ahead, finish.
well, it's like a huge bill that's come due again and again. And
Right.
yes, it is a lot of work. And so when people are like, oh, I'm exhausted, it's like, well, you're exhausted because there's 400 years of work that has got to be done now.
Right. And you can do what you can do in this lifetime. And the other piece around that is that when I was saying this woman, if she were the therapist, might have, what's coming up for her with the crying, what I didn't say, which I should have said, which I'm adding now based on what you just said, which I appreciate and agree with, is when did you first learn about race? When did somebody first teach you about difference? What was that moment when somebody said something at school and your Black, good third grade friend was no longer allowed in the house? What happened to you then? What part of you felt like something was wrong? Like, interrogate that piece of it also, right? Like, those are the
Mhm.
moments about your own history. Forget about like what you didn't learn and, regular textbooks in school and, those kinds of things. But also, like, when did you first become aware of race as a white person, right? And what did that mean to you? And what was that experience? What was your first encounter, to use Janet Helms's language? What was your
Mhm.
first contact with that
Mhm.
experience? And to really kind of reflect on that. And I would invite anybody watching the show to just think about, when did you first learn about race? What was your first encounter with it? What is the somatic reaction that you have now in thinking back to that? And how are you able to be with the part of you that may still be a little bit stuck there about certain things? And can we open up to a reparative process about that now, if it wasn't pleasant? If it was something that caused some kind of like, I gotta step away or not say that again, or my dad didn't want to talk to me after I brought home a Black friend, or whatever it is, Like, what I'm saying is, these are, you know what I mean? People live these things out, right?
Yeah,
I
for
mean, these
sure,
things are
for sure.
crazy.
Yeah, no, I
All right.
mean,
I know it's bananas. Do you want to go do the next tweet or no?
sure,
Okay.
sure.
So this next tweet, this last piece before we finish, it's a little bit off topic, but not exactly. It's kind of like the whole Karen's thing, which is, memes on social media, which Natasha and I, as former journalists turned psychotherapists, I guess we're a little both we dig into the social media, like, chatter, perhaps a bit too much sometimes, I think, for both of us, right? But this is a Woodstock, Georgia, Jimmy John's tweet about a video from an employee down there who, I guess, was making bread dough. And you can see what he's doing there, fashioning it into a noose. And this is like a whole, like, haha moment or whatever. And I guess I wanted to share this because I really want people to, like, understand that this isn't just something that, like, we hear about it in rape culture, and, the frat boys that get let off, and the sexual assault, victims and survivors who, you know, aren't able to be heard by whatever the academic structures are in place, that, like, oh, they're just good kids. Oh, they made a mistake. And that's afforded individually to white people in ways that it is not afforded to usually Black people and people of color. Right.
Mhm.
And so, like, I don't know what's going to happen to this kid. I know the franchisee was reprimanded. And I know that, speaking of 45, apparently the owner of Jimmy John's, not a franchise I'm familiar with, but I guess is supportive of 45. I don't know. But the franchisee was asked to deal with this. But the point is, this is representative of sort of a kind of mentality, a sort of kind of like what's okay. And more indicative is the privilege, along with, I can do this, be reprimanded, and get away with it. Whereas if anyone else did something even remotely like this, who was a person of color or Black, there would be perhaps hell to pay and perhaps a life to pay, whatever
Mhm.
the equivalent would be of this.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I just want to talk a little bit about, how does that inform us as therapists? Are we aware? Are we tuned in to what's happening in the real world enough? Do we
Mhm.
know that Black Twitter and Native Twitter exists? Are we in tune with Indigenous people? Can we find a way to integrate it into our lives so we don't just have to go read books and take classes, as we said, outside of our time, right? Like, do you
Mhm.
know what I mean? Like, instead of doing like Crochet Magazine, can we like read a little bit about this? Not that there's anything wrong with that, because we need to calm down and settle and regulate, but a both and.
Right, and presumably there are many therapists in Woodstock, Georgia, and around, it's not that far from Atlanta. There's school psychologists, there's school counselors. This kid probably goes to a high school that's got a guidance counselor, maybe a school psychologist. You know, these these boys, there's a lot of places where these kids, where there could be interventions. This kid is young, and we often think of these white boys who do these really outrageous things as like, oh, their life is going to be ruined if there's consequences. And the sad part to me is that their life is going to be ruined if there aren't consequences. Like that this is a very unhealthy behavior, and yet there won't be consequences societally. They'll be allowed to continue on in their social structure. There may be there may be personal consequences if they live in an integrated environment, but they're certainly not going to face jail. They're not going to face death. They're going to continue on in this position of perpetrator. And that's sad for them, even though it's not as sad as it is for somebody who's walking out the door like a Trayvon Martin, just to go to, or, the kid in Colorado, you know, where life is
Yeah,
over.
Elijah McCain. Elijah McCain. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, he's a
So,
violinist.
yeah. And so, like, I think there's a lot of work to do for white therapists across the country to begin to call in our people, you know? And for me, I have family in Georgia. My father was from Georgia. This kid could be my son if my family had gone a little bit of a different direction,
Mm,
and how do we engage these mothers and fathers, these kids, in a way that actually is allowing them to heal and to no longer be dangerous in the way that they're dangerous? How can our profession begin to create a structure so that when this kind of thing is captured on video, it's not just Black and brown Twitter that is sort of calling out and saying, like, hey, this is dangerous to us, but that white Twitter and the mental health profession is saying, yes, this kid is a danger to us as well. We need to kind of fold him back in and get him straight so that this generation has a chance to do things differently.
right.
You
All
know,
right. Yeah. I think we're going to have to kind of close down there, or, wind down kind of on that note, because it's 1 o'clock and our time for this week is kind of up. But I just think that invitation, the calling in, is, think about what you would do if it's your son. Think about what you would do if it was your client or your client's son. Think about what you would do if you were trying to be anti-racist and not just non-racist or only protect them in the micro short-term way, and not be so punitive, because we're not asking for revenge. We're asking for equity. We're asking for understanding. We're asking for growth and maturity, right? To be a responsible therapist or parent, what would be appropriate?
Right. And to get out of this idea of like enabling.
Correct.
You know, because that's what we're doing for white teenagers who do things like this at this point.
Right. Yep. Accountability, not enabling. And on that note, Dr. Natasha Stovall, thank you for all the insights.
Thank you, Francesca Maximé.
All right, guys. Well, we'll see you all next week. Same bat time, same bat channel, noontime on Wednesday Eastern. You can always watch the replays of this on YouTube, Soul Liberty Live page. We thank our fearless producer, Brian Wesley Johnson. Check out their other programming on Soul Liberty. It's great. There's everything from health and well-being to even his parents who are therapists who host a show on Sundays. And so we got all kinds of good programming coming up. And also I'll be on a panel on Soul Liberty next month. I believe it's August 1st, showing up for a little bit more of an extended conversation about just where we are with sort of Black Lives Matter and COVID, and just healing practices that we can engage in to kind of keep ourselves sane in the state of the world as we are. So thank you, Dr. Stovall, my friend Natasha. And anybody else, you have any questions, you have story ideas or show ideas or whatever it is, put them in the chat. The replays will be there and we'll check them out. And if we get anything good, we'll circle back. And we'll have a new topic next week. Thanks so much, Natasha. See you, everybody. Bye.
Be safe out there. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Inside Out with Natasha and Francesca here on Soul Liberty TV every Wednesday at noon. Soul Liberty Magazine brings you the best in inspiration on Soul Liberty TV. Check out our new shows. Mark your calendars for Soul Liberty Magazine shows by going to soulliberty.com now.